You're live with BBC News. The former US Vice President Dick Cheney has died at the age of 84. He served 8 years under President George W. Bush and was often called the most powerful vice president in American history. Dick Cheney was widely seen as one of the main architects of the US war on terror, which led to the invasion of Iraq. In a statement, former President George W. Bush said Mr. Cheney's death was a loss to the nation and that he'd be remembered as one of the finest public servants of his generation. Former US Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice described him as a mentor and said he was indefatigable in his determination to defend this country and was patriotic to his core. President Trump has yet to comment on his death. The White House says it has lowered its flags in accordance with statutory law. Well, joining me live now is Paul Hoffman, a longtime aide and friend of Dick Cheney and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Interior in the Bush-Cheney administration. Thanks for joining us here on BBC News, and our condolences to you on the loss of your longtime friend. You knew him for decades. From those early years, did you always think he was destined for the place he now has in the annals of this country's history?
Yes, Katrina, I think he was destined. I think he clearly fulfilled a destiny, and I believe history will be kind to Dick Cheney. There are his detractors, of course, but he always had the country foremost in his heart, the safety of Americans, the security of the country. And I believe his policies were well thought out and well executed. You could disagree with them, but they were what they were.
He will be known, of course, for the invasion of Iraq. What do you think his legacy will be with that as part of it?
Well, I think everybody has 20/20 hindsight and is able to critique a decision after the decision was made. At the time, the U.S. Congress supported the invasion of Iraq. Everybody believed there were weapons of mass destruction. We found out otherwise. That happens. Sometimes intelligence is not as intelligent as we'd like to think.
Okay. And talk to us a little bit about, I mentioned there that you knew him personally, you spent a lot of time out in nature together, which was very important to him.
Well, I'd like to relate a couple stories that I think give a sight into the character and the man that was Dick Cheney. When I worked for him in Wyoming, we oftentimes drove across the state. And you have to realize that Wyoming is a small community with really long streets. Sometimes it's an hour between towns, and we would have a lot of quiet time going down the road. But I remember one time he was discussing a policy that he was considering, and I just listened. I didn't respond in any way. And he said, "What?" And I looked at him and said, What? And he said, "Well, I have the feeling you disagree." And I muttered some disagreement. It was mild, but he went on to explain the policy further. And as I usually did, I kind of smacked my forehead and went, why didn't I think of that? But the point is that he always sought full input. He never wanted to be surrounded by yes men or yes women. He wanted to hear the unbridled truth of issues. And he wanted to know both sides so that he could make an informed decision that he could later defend. And another thing that I think speaks to his character as a leader was right after he was inaugurated as Vice President of the United States in 2001, he organized a reception at the Vice President's residence for all of his former staff, Pentagon staff, congressional staff. And he gathered us at the Naval Observatory there in Washington, D.C., and thanked us from the bottom of his heart for all the work we had done to help him. He said, "I could not have advanced in my career without the help of you." And in Washington, D.C., where a lot of people use other people's backs as rungs in their career ladder, it's really refreshing to hear someone who actually appreciates the efforts you make to help them.
What did it mean for him, Paul, then, everything that happened involving the current President, Donald Trump, January 6th and so on, and ultimately his decision to say he was going to vote for the Democratic candidate in last year's election, to vote for Kamala Harris?
Well, we have a saying in Wyoming, everything in Wyoming is political, except politics, that's personal. I wasn't privy to his thought process on those decisions, but I think there were personal issues there. And I'm sure that knowing Dick Cheney as I do, he made a thoughtful and informed decision. And you could, again, you're free to disagree with it. We have that right in America, but that was his decision to make.
Okay, and as we said, we haven't heard from President Trump yet on his death, but the flags have been ordered to fly at half-mast in his honour. Paul Hoffman, thank you very much for joining us here on BBC News, close friend and aide of the late US Vice President Dick Cheney. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Katrina.